So once we pulled our audio, our sound clips, again, we wanted to keep them inside of our website project folder. Very, very important to have a project folder for your project and not just have an FLA somewhere willy-nilly, again, because it creates these other folders, it creates these other files, and it needs to reference stuff, and you want to keep it all together. So in this assets folder, I've got my 3 sounds that I imported. Audio, really easy, that we just attached it to a keyframe. If you remember, we just created a new sound layer, created a keyframe, and then once we selected the keyframe, like here, I'll go to this keyframe on home, look at my properties panel, and there's this sound drop down, and it just lets you choose from any of the sounds you have imported in the library. To make this whoosh page transition noise, we just created a keyframe at the beginning of each animation, right underneath the frame label where it starts to play. And then we just chose the swoosh. And there you can actually see the waveform. And one other thing we did is instead of only 10 frames, we doubled the length of the animations of the transitions and made them 20 frames so that they're a little bit closer to the length of the sound. You can see the length of the sound goes even further, but in practice, when you look at it in the browser, it feels like it fits. But it's a very common thing if you want to adjust timing on your timeline to match sound. Again, F5 creates frames, can just kind of all the layers at once, can just increase time and stretch an area of the timeline out, or then Shift F5 will do the opposite. And again, I'm just putting my playhead where I want those frames to be added or removed, and making sure I don't actually have anything selected, otherwise it would do it to just that layer. It's a really quick and powerful thing to be able to use F5 and Shift F5 to just add time to all the layers at once or get rid of time. All right, so anyway, enough review. Let's go on and do some new stuff. So easy enough just to slap sound in, and we just were adjusting the timing to make this work. We have 2 more pieces of sound to work with. The first one, let's go in our library and remember what we've got. So we worked on the swoosh. We've got our background music. Very nice. We're going to do that one last because that one will have some complications to it. But our button sound, this one's pretty easy. Select our button. Have a little click sound. So what I want to do is I want to make that click sound happen when I click any of these buttons. So it's really easy to add sound to a button because it really works the same way as adding sound to a timeline. Now again, on a timeline, it doesn't matter if you just go to and stop a frame that starts a sound or if you play through it. There is a way to kind of sync them, but we're going to stick with just the event method here, which is anytime the playhead touches the keyframe that the sound starts on, whether the timeline is stopped or it continues to play, or in this case, it actually plays and then stops before the sound's actually finished. As soon as the playhead touches the keyframe with the sound on it, it's going to play the entire sound, no matter how long it is. Okay, so it's just important to remember. Now the button, what I want you to do is I'm going to unlock my buttons layer to make sure I can actually go inside my buttons. And I'm on the home screen so I can see them all. And let's double click to go inside of our button 1 here. And here I've got a few layers, got an image layer, a fill layer, and a stroke layer. It gives me all my different button states that we set up. Now I'm going to make a new layer and call it sound. And we can attach the sound to button states in the same way we can attach it to the timeline just by adding it to a keyframe in the same way. But in this case, we want the sound to happen when we actually press down on it. All right, so we could put a sound on the rollover. In fact, we'll test that first. Let me try this. I'm going to put a keyframe here. And on the rollover state, I'm going to go to the properties panel, open up the sound drop down, and just choose my button sound. You can see it starts to show the waveform just like that. And because it's on my over state of my first button here now, if I publish in the browser and I roll over my button, I should hear it. I don't hear it. Okay. Didn't like that sound. Let me try putting this on the down state. Maybe it's not liking the overstate for some reason. The down state is really where I want it to end up being. But I want to hear it on the overstate first. That's kind of interesting. It's not playing. We might need to try a different sound. Super odd. But what's going to happen when I click it on the downstate is we're going to actually hear both sounds at once. Because what we should hear is I should hear the clicking sound from actually clicking the button. But as soon as that hits, it's also going to start playing this page transition sound because it jumps. So let's see if it plays both of them. Or if I need to get a different button noise. For some reason, it's just not working. Okay, it worked that time. I'm not sure why it didn't like the overstate, but I don't really care because we don't really care about the overstate anymore either in this touch screen world. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to turn the sound off. I'm going to turn it back, and this is how you can remove sounds. I'm going to select the keyframe from my page 1. I'm going to set it back to none here on page 1. So I can really hear that click sound and not get the swoosh in the way. So now when I click it, so you can see that just like that, it's easy to add a sound to a button. Click, now I have that button click. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to undo with Command Z back to before I deleted my sound there. So now I run it again. If you listen carefully, you should hear both of them. You'll hear the button click and the swoosh because, again, it's playing the one on the button when I click it, but then it's instantly running the command and hitting that next one too. All right, so it does them both. You can layer sounds as much as you want. You don't just have to have one going on at a time. You can do multiple layered things, but just like with images, I would highly recommend that if you do any like sound editing, there is a way to with code, adjust what's going on in the sound, like the volume or panning left and right and stuff like that. But for simplicity's sake, you certainly want to do any kind of sound editing in an external sound editing program and then just bring in the MP3 ready to go. So now we want this clicking sound to be on every single button. Copy and paste it. And the key is knowing what exactly to copy and paste. And in this case, we're going to copy and paste the entire sound layer. So, I mean, we could go into each other button, create a sound layer, keyframe it, add the sound, but just getting used to just copying and reusing everything we can is just going to make life so much easier. So I'm going to right click and just choose copy layers. Remember, we can copy entire layers. And now that I've copied my sound layer, I'm going to go in and paste it onto each of the other 3 buttons just by going in and out of their timeline. So go ahead and go through that process. I'm going to do mine relatively quickly. I can go up to scene 1, double click into button 2, and then I'm going to select the highest layer before I paste it because I want my sound layer to show up on top just so they're kind of all the same. So I'm going to select this stroke layer and then right click and choose paste layers. And when I'm right clicking to either copy the layer or paste the layer, I'm always right clicking and kind of on the layer names. Right? So that pasted, and that pasted not only the sound layer, but it pasted the sound keyframe on the down state. And now that one's good to go. Go back up to scene 1, and then double click to go into button 3. Paste layers. Button 4. Paste layers. All right, just like that. Now I have a sound in every single one of my buttons. But before I test it, there's one more button that I want to add the sound to, and that's our back button. So once you've pasted that layer into each of these button symbols, now go to the end of the animation of any of your pages really, because we're going to do this in one spot and it's going to update in all of them for us. So I'm going to go to page 1, and the reason I'm going to the end of the animation is, at the beginning where I have my page 1 label, well, it's invisible, so it's kind of hard to click on the screen, even though I could. So it makes sense for me to go to the end of the page animation here where the page is resting, and then it's a little easier for me to see it and interact with it. I think in the middle of a tween, yeah, it won't let me like double click. Oh, actually it will. Weird. Okay. Never mind. I guess you can be anywhere in the tween and double click on it. But it always makes sense to me to kind of be where it's resting on the screen because then you'll keep that context of exactly what it looks like with everything else. So I'm going to double click to go inside of my page 1 here. And now I want to just paste that button sound on my back button too. So now that I'm inside of page 1, I have to go inside of back. Now, all my layers are locked. If I made the mistake of just double clicking on back right now when the layer's locked, it's actually going to kick me out. That's something it's kind of annoying. I wish it didn't do in Animate, but if you double click on something inside of a clip that like isn't anything, it'll send you back up the other way. I guess that could kind of be a quick way to do it if you're aware of it, but I think it's more confusing than not. I always use the breadcrumb trail up here to go back up levels. It's a little easier to remember. But regardless, if you find that happening, kind of keep an eye on your breadcrumb trail and realize what's going on. So I can't go inside of back, it keeps kicking me back up. It's because my layer's locked. So if I unlock my layer, and now I can actually double click to go inside of my back button. This is where we want to be. We want to be these 3 levels of inception deep from our main timeline. We're inside of page 1, and then inside of page 1 has a back button, and now we're inside of the back button. Now the cool thing here is because each of the 4 pages is using the same back button symbol, we don't have to go in and add, because on the home page, each of those 4 buttons were 4 different symbols, right? This back button is the same symbol. So all we have to do is add this sound in this one spot, and it'll automatically be added on all of the pages because they're all using the same symbol. So if I right click and paste layers, now I also have this down sound on my back button. And now I can go back up to the main scene. I'm actually going to save this, file, save. Now I'm going to test it out. And each of my buttons now have that click, and that really annoying swoosh. But when I click this back button now, it should click and not swoosh. Awesome. Works on each page and on the back button on each page. Easy enough, right? Just kind of knowing where to put the sound. So again, anywhere on the timeline, if you're putting sound effects on an animation, if you're making page transitions, you know, at any point you want a sound to happen, you just put it on a keyframe and it'll play as soon as the playhead hits that spot. I think it's, you know, you can stick it on any old keyframe, just like you can stick code on any old keyframe, but it's very good practice to keep all your code on a code layer and keep all your sound on a sound layer. There's some interesting things that we're going to have to deal with to make music just looping appropriately and playing like we want from our application here. And I'll show you why. There's 2 major pitfalls we're going to get through. So what we're going to try first is I'm going to go to my library, got my music, test it out here. Here it's some kind of bad sounding classical noises. I like classical music, but that didn't sound like a great intro. So I want this just to be playing the whole time, okay? So initially, I want it to start out just right when my thing opens, right? So I'm gonna try and put the sound right here on frame 1. Right when it opens, it's on the home page, it should just play. Probably not going to, but I'll explain why. Let's do this. I'm gonna go ahead and put my music right here on frame 1. And in theory, you would expect that when it opens up, you would expect to just hear this music playing. But it's not, okay? Even stranger than that is, I'll bet you that if I click on one of these buttons, doesn't even matter which one, we're gonna start to hear that music play. Nope, that didn't do it. Interesting. Well, regardless, let's see if it does it on any of them. Oh, okay. So it started playing on the first button and the second one. Maybe I just wasn't refreshed. Okay, yeah. I don't think I was looking at the right version of my website. So now that I have the right version, or maybe it just needed me to click one of those first. But the key is that this is something that Chrome did to us about a year ago, which is super annoying. Chrome and then Safari followed suit. I think Firefox might still work automatically, but regardless, Chrome is by far the most used browser, so we have to bow down to what they want us to do. And what they decided, and it's so annoying that they did this, but they decided that too many people out there were just making sounds happen when the user didn't want to hear sound. Like ads and people, you know, have you ever been looking at a page and you just hear audio from an ad and you can't figure out how to turn it off and it's super annoying? Chrome finally made it about a year and a half ago, where audio is not allowed to play on a page, whether you're using Animate or just straight up HTML. Audio is not allowed, or video for that matter, if it has audio in it. That's why you see all these silent videos start to play until you unmute them on you know, their social media feeds and things like that. Is they basically decided this is what people want. Is they made it so that the user must press a button and actually interact with the page before audio is allowed to play. Okay, and that's the only reason, like for years and years and years, we could stick audio right on the first frame, and when we'd open our thing up, it would be playing. And all we had to do was tell it to loop, and we'd have background music. But now Chrome decided that they are smarter than developers, and because a bunch of idiots out there are pissing people off with audio, playing it when we don't want to hear it, now none of us are able to play it when we want to, and it's just a rule that we have to wait until we press a button. Now, this is another example of, you know, when you're creating things for the web, things are constantly changing. And, you know, once upon a time, about a year ago, I had to spend like 3 days of going nuts trying to figure out what was going on and why all of a sudden I had all these applications that the audio wasn't working right. And it ended up to be nothing I did wrong, just the browser decided to change the rules, and, you know, so it is. That's what happens sometimes. So I mentioned it a couple times today, but really, you know, troubleshooting and trying to find a way around things is a big part of developing for the web, because, you know, you run into all kinds of issues, whether they're your fault or not. So what can we do about this? What can we do to make it so we can actually hear our sound when we get to our home page? The answer is really kind of convoluted in the sense that we're just going to make a page before the home page that has a start button that you have to click on to get to the home page. But we're going to set up a splash screen that happens before our home screen that just basically says start, and then we're going to set up all of our loopy music and stuff. All right, so for right now, I'm going to remove that music clip that I tried to put on the first frame. Again, I just selected the keyframe on the sound layer on frame 1, went over to my properties panel, and just set the sound drop down back to none. Okay, so really important to understand that kind of hiccup of, hey, how the heck do I get, you know, music, background music throughout my whole thing? Because if I were to just try and put it on one of these pages, I wouldn't know from the user standpoint which page they're going to click on first. And I wouldn't want to put it on every page, because then all of a sudden it would kind of start playing over itself like a bad row your boat thing. So anyway, we're gonna put a page before our home page. So the first thing that's kind of funky here is, for the very first time, we're gonna try and put things before frame 1 on our timeline. So right now our home page is all set up on frame 1. We've got our code keyframe, we've got our buttons keyframe that holds all our buttons, we've got our title, and then we've even got our background that's sitting there across everything. I'm going to leave the background layer locked because our start page can have that background too. That's fine. What I'm going to want to do, in fact, our title can probably stay there too. We're going to keep our background and our title. And what we're going to do is we're just going to want to move our buttons to a different spot on the timeline and replace them with one big start button. All right? But what we need to do is we can't really put anything to the left of frame 1, so we have to move our home page out a little bit and then give ourselves some more frames to work with. All right, so that's what we're going to do. I want you to take the home page, and by the home page, I mean, sorry, this keyframe that had on the code layer, this keyframe on frame 1. I'm going to unlock the layer. I have every See, I'm going to lock my title and my background layer, but I'm going to leave everything else unlocked. And I'm going to take, and I just want to move this over a little bit. In fact, maybe I'll move it over to frame 5. So all I did is just click and drag this over. So now I have nothing on frame 1. And now I have my button code and my home label and everything on frame 5. I could have put it on frame 2. I could have put it on frame 10. Doesn't really matter. I just want a little bit of space before it so I can put some stuff before that. Okay, so I'm just going to leave it on 5. Actually, I'm going to leave it on 10. And then I'm going to put my playhead in between 10 and 15. I'm going to hit F5 5 times to give myself 10 frames of spacing around it on each side. I just like to have at least 10 frames of spacing when I'm setting things up because it gives me enough space to have a frame label that's more than like 3 or 4 letters if I need it and still be able to read it. All right, so the other thing we're going to want to move, and instead of just keyframing, I'm actually moving these things, which means I'm removing them from the first frame. Okay, so the first frame, this home label and the code, there's really nothing visual on the screen to see, but we want to do the same thing with all these buttons. So I'm going to take my keyframe with all of my buttons here, and I'm going to actually drag it and move it. Now be aware, if you look at my screen for a second, when you're moving things around the timeline, it's very important to realize you have to make the selection first. Let go of your mouse, and then click and drag to start moving it. So let me show you what I mean. If I were to just start to click and drag this keyframe as if I could just move it right away, it actually starts to click and drag out this blue selection. And maybe I'll let go here, and all of a sudden I've got all these keyframes selected, and then if I try and move it, it moves all of them together, my whole selection, and now all of a sudden I move this blank keyframe, and now all of a sudden I've got buttons on Marvin's page, and it's all screwed up. So I'm going to undo with Command Z a couple of times. What's really important to realize is that you have to make your selection first. So there I selected my buttons keyframe just by clicking and letting go. It's highlighted blue. And after I've selected it and let go, now I can click it again, and it's going to drag it and actually move it. So I want you guys to see that difference between, like, you can't just click a keyframe and drag it and start moving it. What you're really doing is selecting. So you can select all kinds of keyframes and layers together and then move them. But if you're only doing one at a time, it's important to realize that you have to actually click to select it first, let go, and then click again to drag it and move it. Okay, so we're going to do that to our buttons keyframe. So it's directly underneath our home title. So once we've done that, all we've done is clicked and dragged our home movie clip and clicked our keyframe, I'm sorry, not movie clip, and then clicked and dragged our buttons keyframe here, both of which to where there's now blank keyframes on the code layer and the buttons layer on frame 1, and you should see those buttons disappear. Okay, so on frame 1 now, we have a different page. And I want to name this page. I'm going to put a frame label on the code layer. I'm going to name it Start. All right, so this is going to be our Start page. All right, so the next thing we want to realize is we want to stop the timeline right here again. We just moved all of our code, so if I were to play this movie right now, what it would do is it would just see a blank spot for 1/3 of a second, and it would still stop on the home page. In fact, I'll do that and show you. I'm going to publish it. Boom, you can see it's just 1/3 of a second that just blinks, and then it still works the exact same because our buttons are still set up, and they're still going to the places, and then our back button is still telling it to go to and stop this home label. That's another good illustration of why we use labels, because if we were to just use the frame number and we're telling that back button to go to and stop frame 1 instead of the home label, then we would have to go in and change the code on that button now because we moved it around. That's a beautiful thing about frame labels is when we're talking to them in code and we're telling buttons to jump around and go to certain frame labels, we can actually move those frame labels around and the button code still works. It just changes where it goes in the timeline. It's a real powerful thing. But what we really want is we don't want it to play and then stop here. We want it to stop right here. We don't want to be able to get to the home screen unless we actually push a button and tell it to go to the home screen. And the whole purpose, again, of doing that is we'll then start our music here and everything will work great. So let's just take one step at a time. The first step was we created a new page just by moving our home page up the timeline a little bit, keyframing the buttons away and making them show up right where the home page is. Then we added a frame label for start. Now I'm actually going to cut and paste the stop command from the home page to the start, because we don't need it on the home page anymore, because ultimately our start button, we're going to tell it to go to and stop home. So I'm going to open up the code on the home page. Again, just selecting that code keyframe that has the home label on it. So we see all our button code, our console saying our bodacious bunnies are ready, the timeline, our stop, all this stuff. On the home page, we can just delete this timeline.stop completely. I'm going to get rid of that. It doesn't really hurt to have it there, but it's not going to be necessary. So we're going to use the button to tell it to stop instead of the actual timeline. So I just deleted that completely. And then on frame 1, which is now the start frame, I just want to put a stop command. Now let's just use the this.stop so we don't have to actually write that timeline variable for this. So what we should end up with, pull this up a little bit. There we go. So on our timeline now, we've got our start keyframe that says this.stop, open close parentheses, semicolon, and that's going to stop the timeline and not let it go anywhere. And then on the home frame, we've still got our variable, our console log, and then all of our buttons, which will still work once we get there. But for right now, close this actions panel. Oops. A little shortcut I use. I always leave my actions panel up, kind of hovering up here. And then you can double click on the actual word actions to make it come and go. Or you can use F9 to make the whole thing disappear or reappear. Okay. But if I were to test my movie now with that stop command on frame 1, now it just sits there waiting and does nothing. Okay. That's exactly what we want, because we're going to want to put a play button here and make this our start page. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to keep my graphics consistent, and I'm just going to make a version of the back button and make this into a play button or a begin button or a start button. I'll call it start since I named the thing start. So I'm going to want to put this button on the buttons layer. We're not going to animate it. We're not going to do any tweening. So it's perfectly fine to have all of these buttons on a keyframe on our home page and to just keep our buttons layer and put a button here. So I'm going to go into the library. I'm going to drag a copy of my back button onto the stage here. Okay. Now I should see that it put it on the keyframe right here on my buttons layer, which was empty. Make sure you're on your buttons layer before you drag that back button onto your stage. So now I should be able to look between my home page and my start page, and I should be able to see those buttons. Now we actually have 3 keyframes on our buttons layer. We have our keyframe on frame 1. It's holding our initial back button that we're about to change to be a start button. We have our keyframe on the home page that's holding all of our 4 buttons we set up to be able to get to our pages. And then we have a keyframe that's blank on page 1, which persists across all these pages, which basically makes all those buttons go away so we don't see them and all we see is our pages. All right, so now that all this stuff is in the right spot, we've moved our home page over a little bit. So all we did is we just moved 2 keyframes over, moved our code keyframe, moved our buttons keyframe, and then back here at the beginning, we added a stop command and a frame label, and now we added this copy of the back button. Now I'm going to duplicate this and turn it into a next button. The reason I'm duplicating is I want to keep the button states, I want to keep the font, I want to keep the font size, I want to keep all that stuff and just kind of change the label and reuse it. So before I change the label, I'm going to center this. So wherever you dragged it, I'm going to open the Align panel, make sure Align to Stage is checked. I'm just going to click the two centering buttons. You don't have to make it perfect and center it. You can just drag it where you like, but I liked it to be perfectly centered. Now that it's ready and it's perfectly centered, now I'm going to turn this into a different button by duplicating it. So if I right-click on my button, go down to Duplicate Symbol. Remember, we've done this 3 or 4 times before to duplicate our other buttons and reuse them. And now instead of back, I'm going to name it Start. All right, now that I duplicated it, now I've got 2 separate buttons in my library for back and for start, which means I can now double click inside of this one and I can see on the breadcrumb trail up here that it says start. And now I can safely change what's in here, okay? So this label, instead of back with a little arrow pointing that way, I'm gonna change it to start, little arrow pointing that way. And then I have to do it on my over keyframe as well, because this is the one that I keyframed and set the transparency down to 50%. So I'm gonna set that to start like that as well. And then the hit state, I can leave the same, and the sound, I can leave the same. So again, by duplicating, I was able to retain the button sound, the hit state, and the font and the placement and all of that good stuff. I just changed the actual label on these 2 different keyframes. All right, I'm gonna go back up a level. And the last thing we're gonna do before we actually put code on this button and make it work is I want to make sure this has an instance name and a correct instance name. Right now I'm on my text tool because that's what I last used, and that's not gonna help me here. So I need to get my selection tool and actually select my button on the stage. And I can see that this button has no instance name because I dragged it out of the library. So I'm going to give it an instance name named Start. All right, so I'm going to save my file. So if I look at this in the browser right now, it is stopped on that frame, waiting for something to happen. And I've got my rollover, my down state here. I can actually click it and make the noise, but we don't have any code attached to this for it to do anything yet. Okay, so we have our start screen ready. And again, this is kind of before you ever try and program a button, always kind of just set up the timeline, set it up with so you can just take your playhead and move it to see where you want to go. So it's sitting here, stopped here, and we just want to tell it to go here, right? We made sure that our start button has a label, it's named start, and now we can put our code on our code keyframe. Now, it's really important when you're coding buttons to make sure that you put the button code on the same spot on the timeline vertically where that button actually lives. So right now, for example, we have all this button code on our home button, or on our home page on this actual keyframe that says home, which is now not on the first frame anymore, because all of these buttons, button 1, button 2, button 3, and button 4, don't exist until we actually get to this spot on the timeline. So I'm going to copy one of these buttons, one of the pieces of button code here, so we can put it on the start page. Now, if I were to have all that button code on the start page, it would throw us a bunch of errors because it wouldn't be able to find these buttons. Same that if we were to try and put our start button code here on this keyframe, it would throw errors because it would not be able to find the start button, right? So it's really important to make sure that you're putting the code in the right spot on the timeline. So we're just gonna, I just copied some button code and we're gonna put it on frame 1. So I'm gonna open up frame 1 on our start thing here. Down a couple levels, I'm gonna paste it in. Now, one thing here is we're probably gonna monkey with this in a minute to play with the variable, but we do need to add our timeline variable because that's what we're using down here. So let's go ahead and add var timeline equals this. The exact same thing we put here on the home as well. Okay. After we get this all working, we'll probably revisit for a second and see if we need this one here or if it will remember it from over here. And if it doesn't remember it, there's something we can do to kind of make it work. But for right now, we'll leave it like this. So we're defining our variable named timeline to be equal to this, which basically represents the timeline. It just changes. If we were to try and say this right here, it wouldn't work because this is no longer the timeline once you're inside of a function. I keep mentioning that, but it can be a very confusing thing about JavaScript that we need to remember, which is why we're making this variable. So now we just need to change this button code to work the way we want it. So the first thing we change, so I don't need to remember the syntax or anything, I just need to know what needs to be changed. First thing is the actual button name. So this is not named button 1. This is named start. I'm going to change it to say this.start.on. And I've got my click, and my function, and then timeline.goTo and play. It's exactly what we're going to want. So we're going to move the timeline, but we are not going to want to play it because then it would just go and play in page 1, or we'd have to put a stop in somewhere, and we took the stop out. We want to tell it to go to and stop. And then we don't want to tell it to go to and stop page 1. We want to tell it to go to and stop home. Should match this frame label exactly. So we pretty much did the same thing we kind of had before. We are stopping the timeline. All right, we're saying this dot stop. We could just as easily put this below our variable and say timeline dot stop. They use this, it's the same thing, but usually I just stick with this dot stop. Again, one more time, the reason we actually have to make this is because if we said this dot go to and stop, it will not work because the word this changes what it means. When we're up at this level, it means the timeline, but as soon as we go inside of a button function that we set up with an on-click here, the word this inside that function suddenly means the button. And telling the button to go to and stop doesn't make sense and won't do anything. So it's just a weird thing, but that's part of JavaScript, one of the first things we need to learn. So because we make this variable named timeline, that when we hit this dot start, when we click it, then the timeline should go to and stop home. Let's try that out. I'm gonna go ahead and run my thing. It is stopped, keeps opening more and more of these tabs every time I hit command return, which is fine. But we've got it ready. It's sitting here waiting for the user interaction. And as soon as I click it, it worked. So it goes to and stops this home page. All right, nothing really new. No new techniques. We've done that before, just making a button work and jump to the next spot on the timeline that we want it to using the label, but just specifically kind of moving over a page that was already on frame 1, including all of its code and its buttons, and replacing frame 1 with something new, with a different set of button code, because we keyframed in a new button on this page. Okay, so now we should be able to just press start and jump to our home page. So the whole reason we set that up, okay, I'm gonna hit save again because that's a nice stopping point that I can actually press this button now and jump here. The whole point was based on our music, okay? So this is actually kind of interesting what's gonna happen here. Let's start with, we wanna put our sound, we want it to start on the home page, so I'm gonna keyframe my sound layer on my home page. Again, what I mean by that is I'm actually putting my playhead right at the same vertical location as my home keyframe that's labeled home. And I keyframe the sound layer, which creates this little empty keyframe. And when I select that keyframe, or it's still selected after I just created it, now I can go over to the properties panel and see where it should have frame selected here if I actually have clicked the frame on the timeline. And now I can add my music. Okay? And even though, if I set my playhead in between home and page 1 here, even though I could add all kinds of frames and see that my music, I don't remember how long it is, I think it's like 10 seconds long, but you can see the entire waveform just pushes way, way far beyond. But hold Command Z and undo all of that. It's back to where it started. Once again, just putting the playhead in the middle here and not having anything selected, using F5, Shift F5, really, really powerful to just add time and add space across all your layers. I said it 10 times today because it is that important to know how to do. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Oops, I'm going to keep undoing. There we go. That's the way it was. It does not matter how long the time the audio clip is. It could be 10 hours long, and it will play 10 hours of audio. The browser will probably crash, but that's another story. As long as it actually touches this keyframe that the audio begins on, it'll play the whole thing. So we start off by having our timeline stopped right here with our stop command. When we press our button, we tell it to go to and stop here. And so it should begin playing our background music. And no matter where we go from here, it should continue playing our background music. Right now it's not looping yet, but we'll start by just testing this. I'm going to hit start. Sure enough, there's my background music. Continues to play. And it only played for that long, okay? But you can see that if I do it again, it actually starts again at the home page. And at some point, I'm actually hearing 3 sounds at once. Once this starts playing, and then I click one of these buttons, it's playing the background music, it plays the button click sound, and it plays the page transition sound all at the same time. All 3 levels of sound going on. So pretty cool, easy enough, right? And that works well enough for our purpose right now where, okay, we play that little sound, it's going, we go to the other pages. It's not very long, so when we go back to the home page, it starts playing again, which works when it's not very long. But now let me show you how to loop a sound, because ultimately you've seen how you can just add a sound to the timeline. That's all we've done here, the exact same way we added the page transition swoosh sound. We've also added a sound to a button, just added it to a keyframe. But so far, we've only wanted to play these sounds once. With background music, typically, you want it to loop. I'm going to show you how that works. So if we select the sound on the keyframe where we actually added it and look at the properties panel here, you can see that underneath the dropdown for choosing the actual sound, there's a couple other options. There's a sync option, which has event versus stream. And then there's a repeat option that lets you choose how many times you want it to repeat or just tell it to loop infinitely. First, let me just explain the sync thing. The difference is event, the default, will play the entire sound when you hit the keyframe. Stream will attempt to kind of lock the timeline to the sound. Stream is really useful if you're just doing an animation and you have no interactivity and your timeline is just plain. Maybe you've got a 5-minute long animation with a 5-minute audio track and you kind of want them to stay synced together even if the user's computer gets slow and drops some of the animation frames. Stream will give you the ability to do that. We typically want to stay with event because we're always jumping around on the timeline and we don't want the music to stop when we jump around. We want it to continue playing no matter what we do, okay? So we're going to leave it on event, which means that it's going to play the whole sound as soon as it touches the keyframe that starts it. But not only that, it'll also play as many repeats as we tell it to. So I'm just going to set it to loop. I usually only either repeat one or loop. Sometimes you might want to repeat a sound 2 or 3 times. There's a specific number of loops, that's fine. But if I set it to loop, now we're going to get the benefit of it's going to continuously loop and play. So let it carry through. Okay, so that picks back up. It's going to loop forever. I'm going to go into one of my other pages. I'm going to turn my speaker down a minute, and here's where it's going to cause a problem. Is it's infinitely looping, and as soon as we hit the home page, it's going to start another infinite loop. And every time now, when I go back to the home page, it's going to start another infinite loop, and it's going to start going on top of itself. Now I'm going to turn my sound up here so you can hear it as I do it, and you can hear how screwed up this gets. The key is that we just need to make this start somehow before the home page. Okay, so our start screen, instead of just jumping right to the home page and having this infinite loop begin when we get to the home page, we're going to have the start screen maybe go to and play this, or maybe we'll just play and we'll just have it play across here and then stop on the home. We basically want this to play only one time. We only want the playhead to hit this one time, and that'll start our music. And then when we get to our home page, no matter how many times we jump and go back, jump and go back, jump and go back, we're never ever again going to touch the keyframe where the music started. Does that make sense? I can show you how to set this up, but that's really the key here, is we want to make sure that we don't keep going back and hitting the same keyframe. Now that's perfectly fine with these, because every time we play this page transition, we're going to want to hear that sound. But this is just kind of a trick when it comes to looping music that we'd want in the background the whole time, that if we keep going back to the scene of the crime, back to the keyframe where we set up the looping music, it's just going to loop over itself over and over, and it gets really frustrating. So to do this, go ahead and just drag this back a few frames. In fact, I'm just going to put it on frame 5. All right, and what I'm going to do now, I'm going to kind of talk through it first, and then we'll actually do it. So right now, the timeline is sitting here stopped on the very first keyframe, and it's waiting for the user to push this button. And when the user pushes this button, we're telling it to go to and stop home. So right now, our music won't play because it's going to skip over this keyframe we have sitting here. It's going to jump right here, and nothing's going to happen. It's never going to start that music. Okay? Because there's no reason for it to start, because it never actually touches this keyframe. So what we want to do is, I think the easiest thing is we'll actually just let this 1/3 of a second play. So instead of saying go to and stop the home screen, on this start button, I'm going to change it just to say play. And it's going to play. It's going to hit this on its way through to start the music. And then when it gets here, we're going to tell this frame to stop again. That stop that we got away. Now, there's a reason I keep kind of changing and moving things around. It may seem frustrating, but it's because this is what you kind of need to get used to be able to do on your own. You need to get used to thinking through, you know, how is this timeline, you know, where is it stopped? How am I telling it to play? How am I telling it, you know, when the user pushes a button, does it go to and play? Does it go to and stop? You know, where is it going? What keyframes is it hitting? That's really the main key of being able to think through how to do these things and how to set things up. So in this case, again, I'm going to change this button code to tell it just to play, and then we're going to tell this frame to stop. Instead of right now, having a button that just does a go to and stop. So understanding go to and play, go to and stop, and then just creating a regular stop command to move however you want around on the timeline. You know, hopefully that's starting to feel a little bit more comfortable, but if it still feels confusing, that's something you should kind of practice on your own, is just creating these different methods of buttons to go to and play, go to and stop, and then stopping after the timeline's playing. That's how we're going to control what we see on our screen in all kinds of different ways. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to open up the code for the start button. And instead of timeline.goTo and stop home, I'm going to change it just to say timeline.play. And just like stop, play is a command that will just play the timeline. And just like stop, we need to end it with our open close parenthesis and our semicolon. All right, so that'll make it so we'll just start playing through. It's going to hit our music. And then finally, when we get to the home page, I'm going to do the stop again. I'll put it at the top. Say this.stop. So when it actually plays through, hits that music, and then it'll stop on our home page and wait again for the user to then push a button. I'm going to go to Animate, Preferences, Edit Preferences, and then to Code Editor. Here I'm going to double it up to 24, really blow it up. Boom. So we have our stop command that you should definitely be familiar with by now. Created our variable to represent our timeline. Telling our start button that should have this instance name, that when we click on it, do whatever inside of this function. And inside of it, we're telling the timeline to play. And that should make it play. We'll hit our keyframe to start our infinite loop of music. And then boom, we set up a stop command again on our home page, which has timeline variable again, our console log saying we're ready, and then all of our other buttons. And I'm going to run it now. And now in theory, we should be able to click all around our pages and we'll hear our background music looping and it won't start doubling over itself because every time it goes to hit the home, it won't hit that keyframe that starts it again. All right, very nice. So I, of course, am going to save this.